addiction is a progressive disease, whether it's with alcohol and drugs or whether it's pornography or whether it's with food. It starts as some kind of thing that may or may not be problematic, and then it starts to become problematic. But there's a difference between being problematic and being addictive. And so I've heard both of those conversations in the rooms where men are starting to question or have started to question whether or not they're addicted to this, but they've never been in a space where they can actually say that question out loud.
Because of desensitization, many porn consumers find themselves consuming more porn, consuming more often, or consuming more extreme forms of pornography. In fact, according to a 2016 study, researchers found that 46.9% of respondents reported that over time, they began watching pornography that had previously disinterested or even disgusted them. Get more fast facts about the impacts of pornography and exploitation at ftnd.org/fast facts. That's ftnd.org/fast facts.
My name is Garrett Jonsson, and you're listening to Consider Before Consuming, a podcast by Fight the New Drug. And in case you're new here, Fight the New Drug is a non-religious and non-legislative organization that exists to provide individuals the opportunity to make an informed decision regarding pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects using only science, facts, and personal accounts. We want these conversations to be educational, uplifting, and hopeful. As we sit down with experts, influencers, activists, and people with personal accounts, we cover a wide variety of topics that may be triggering to some. You can refer to the episode notes for a specific trigger warning. Listener discretion is advised. Today's episode is with Rus Funk. While Rus was earning his undergraduate degree, he worked in a rape crisis center and got curious about how porn can promote sexual violence. Fast forward to today, and Rus has been dedicated to advancing gender, sexual, and racial equality for over 30 years. One of his biggest projects is a curriculum called What's Wrong with This Picture, which aims to support men in examining the negative impacts of their porn consumption. During this conversation, we talk about how porn consumption can negatively impact men, how porn can promote sexual violence, and how his curriculum can help men become a better version of themselves. With that being said, let's jump into the conversation. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Consider Before Consuming. You've been working for how long in this field?
Do we really have to say that? 30-something?
30 years. So you've been working 30 years for this moment right now.
Right here. With you.
No,
That's right.
No, just joking. But 30 years. 30 years is a long time. You've put in some time. I'm sure you've learned some things. And for that, we are grateful.
Thank you. And it's, this work is hard and trying and often discouraging, but also is really affirming. And so, my parents raised me with the belief that you give back the degree to which you've been blessed. And the unfortunate catch of living a life like that is that you can't. And the more you give back, the more you're blessed. So you're not only can you never catch up, you're always falling behind.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I say all that to say is, the ways that I have been blessed by doing this work and the people that I've been able to meet and work with far outweigh anything that I could have contributed. So,
well, that's a good perspective to hold. I think that's a healthy perspective to hold. Can you lay a little bit of the foundational work, just kind of explain who you are and where you're from, maybe some of those family dynamics?
Sure. My name is Rus Funk. I am based in Louisville, Kentucky. The work that I do is kind of broadly based, working to primarily focusing on engaging and mobilizing men to engage actively in work to promote gender equality and gender justice. And one of the significant barriers to gender equality and gender justice is pornography use, and pornography as an institution and as a drug. And like I said, I've been doing this since the 80s. and I got into this work more broadly, largely because of who my parents are and how they raised me to be. I grew up in South Texas. My parents were early on kind of grassroots community-based sexuality educators. And so really driving home the idea that that good sex is something that happens between human beings who actually like and respect each other.
Yeah.
And that's the value. That's what we hold.
Mm-hmm.
They were the folks who did that kind of sexuality. We had a small college in town. They did some of their work through the college, but I remember some of the things that they did with the college students, not obviously with us, we were too young, but most of the time the conversations were in our home. So
you lived under the same roof.
Right. And, the conversations were around the dining room table or in the living room, and, we would be scooted off to our bedrooms, but, we had our ears to the door.
Right.
There's some very interesting conversations that my parents would facilitate. So
it's interesting that your parents had to educate on that version of sex, like the healthy version of sex, because it's such a basic concept, but it has like you talk to, pornography is misconstruing that. It's sending messages that don't align with what your parents were teaching.
Right. Absolutely. And, I think back in the day, this is in the 70s and 80s in South Texas. As I mentioned, right now, I'm in Kentucky. Yes, we do have to keep educating and intentionally and actively educating about that, because it's especially to men and boys, because they're not getting the information anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, these days, I grew up pre-internet, pre-computer. So there was, my access to sexuality education was thankfully my parents, until I became an adolescent. And then I was like, oh my God, no, please. And the library.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean when you put your hands over your face and you said no, like you were resenting?
Oh my God.
What were you resenting? Can you elaborate on that emotion?
Absolutely. I was so tired of hearing it from my parents.
Oh, okay.
Because it was my parents, right? And I was like, oh, really? I got it. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. I think most kids can relate to that sentiment. If their parents are talking to them about sex, I think they can relate to that sentiment.
Yes.
Most parents in your generation and in my generation, they didn't have the conversation about the birds and the bees, right? They did not have that conversation. And if they did have it, it was one time, but it sounds like your parents had it hundreds of times.
Well, and the other piece that I also have a 12-year-old, so I'm in a differently being able to practice this in real time.
Right.
But I didn't realize how much of the conversation around sex and sexuality in our country is still so shame-based. And kids walk away with, I can't talk about it, but if I am talking about it, it's embarrassing and it's shameful and it's, excruciating. And my parents did a really good job around, not shaming us for having questions, not shaming us for having feelings or being confused or whatever it was.
Yeah. They acknowledge the curiosity, the natural curiosity that's within each of us. And sounds like they acknowledge that each of us are here because of sex. Like we can't, each of us exist because of it. And sometimes it's a tough topic to talk about. And so anyway, your parents, they did a good job. They raised an individual. You seem like a decent individual doing good work. And like you said, trying to engage and mobilize men and boys to become the best version of themselves. Is that kind of how you describe your work?
Absolutely. And, again, kind of borrowing from what I learned from my parents, I have some really strong feelings about pornography and the damage that it does and what the industry does. But I don't have that. I don't share that disgust with the people who use pornography. And that's a really important message that I try and engage in when I'm talking with men about this is I'm not going to hide the fact that I have these strong feelings about the pornography as an industry. I'm not going to hide the fact that I have strong feelings about smoking in the tobacco industry. That doesn't mean I hate smokers. Right. And I've got people who smoke who I love and care about, but the tobacco industry intentionally puts things into cigarettes that addict you, that make it hard for you to quit, that drive you into the next pack of cigarettes. Pornography does the same thing. That doesn't mean I hate people who view pornography. It means I hate
Okay.
the industry.
Yeah. So you can hate on the behavior and also at the same time have empathy and acceptance for the individual.
Yeah. Or I think, and that's a nuance that is hard to tease out, especially, when men are just getting into these conversations. My own experience is that men are having pornography is this thing. It's like this accepted secret, right? We all know that men look at pornography. We all know that this is a common thing that men do, but men don't ever talk about the fact that we do this. And there's some shaming and there's some, embarrassment around that. And I found that, for me to have any kind of productive conversations, especially someone who is outwardly critical of pornography, I have to start with, this ain't about you all. I respect and value you all and who you are as human beings. And I want to bring us into a conversation around something that's really hard for us frequently to have a conversation about.
Right. Well,
that means creating as brave a space as possible.
Right. I grew up in the locker room. I grew up playing sports. I grew up in that environment. And as a heterosexual male, you saying that it's something that we do as men, we often normalize porn consumption, but then we don't talk about it. It's a secret. It's an accepted secret. Is that how you described it?
Yes.
I think there's a lot of truth there. From my experience in the locker room, we did talk about porn consumption, but it wasn't a serious conversation. We didn't ever discuss the harmful effects of pornography. We didn't ever discuss how it was impacting us or the negative side. We would just joke about it, right? We would talk about it, but not in a more vulnerable way.
Yeah. It's kind of similar to dating. In my mind, in my experience, it's kind of similar to that dating conversation. We don't talk critically about dating or how I'm dating or how am I treating the person who I'm flirting with and dating as if they're a worthwhile human being. It's, jawing to each other around and bragging and, stripping the humanity out of that conversation. So
that's interesting. Going back to what I said earlier, I was born in the mid 80s. I grew up playing sports. I grew up in the locker room. I heard all of that talk. And I'm a person who really enjoys masculinity. I embrace my masculinity. And at the same time, I get curious about how those environments negatively impacted me and my behavior. I don't know if you know much about me, Russ, but I used to be your typical porn consumer. And I grew up consuming porn from a very young age and continued. And my porn consumption escalated as porn escalated. And what I mean by that is I went from Playboy magazines to VHS to a little bit of internet porn consumption. And then when the smartphone became available, that's when my porn consumption it escalated significantly at that point. And it wasn't until I heard about Fight the New Drug that I pivoted away from porn consumption. And from there, I got real curious as to why how were those environments negatively impacting my behaviors and my thought processes and my perspective toward women. And so I think that I am basically like an interesting case study for you as a professional, because I kind of like am the epitome of what you are fighting, or I used to be. Does that make sense? Because today I'm at zero porn consumption and I no longer consume porn, but I used to be that individual. I used to engage in that behavior. Am I accurate in stating that? I don't experience it as fighting. I really like your language of curiosity, because with the project, with what's wrong with this picture, the idea is to go in with this sense of curiosity and encouragement to get to where you are, of like start to look at, is there an impact of me viewing pornography?
What is that impact?
Mm-hmm.
So as an example, one of our first activities asks men to remember in their bodies their first experience of viewing pornography. And almost universally, men have a mixed experience. There's, of course, the pleasure and the excitement and the curiosity and all that, but there's also a level of outedness, if I can.
Yeah, or like disgust or feeling freaked out. That makes sense.
There's some sense of, embarrassment or shame or ickiness, or I don't know that I like this, or I don't know what this is, confusion. But because, as you described as the locker room talk, all we talk about, typically as men who view pornography, all we talk about is, that I liked it and that it's fun. And we don't ever talk about that shadow side, right? And what we know about trauma, I don't think viewing pornography is a trauma, but I think there's some lessons we learn from trauma. What we know about trauma is those negative experiences, if we don't get a chance to unpack them, they become like magnets for the next time we have the experience.
Yeah.
Right. So men view pornography for the first time and they have a mixed feeling. They can talk about the positive experience. They can't talk about the negative experience of it. So but there's enough of a positive experience because of the way pornography is constructed that they go to watch it again.
Right.
Well, that then reinforces the positive side, but it also reinforces the hidden negative side.
Right.
And so here we are sometimes 20, 30 years later, and I'm in a group of men who've never had a conversation, a meaningful conversation with each other pornography. And the first conversation is, wow, as I'm in my body and remembering in my body what this was like, I'm remembering that it was in fact mixed. And I've been carrying for 30 years, this ickiness. It was my first experience.
Yeah.
And what an opportunity to just, in terms of group dynamics, to share that with each other, but also to kind of reinforce the need to get curious around what has this experience been. And so I see my job as much more around how do I hold spaces where men can be curious with each other without shame, without blame, without judgment, just get curious. And I trust that curiosity, as you described it, that curiosity leads them to come to conclusions that they start deciding they need to change their behavior about viewing pornography.
Yeah. I wanted to read a couple stats because when I read these stats, when I learned of these stats, my mind was blown. And I think they're relevant to the conversation. This stat says, according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, some 47,000 women and girls were killed by their intimate partners or other family members during 2020. This means that on average, a woman or a girl is killed by someone in their own family every 11 minutes. 47,000. Another stat that really hit hard for me was, on average in the US, 20 people are assaulted every minute by their intimate partners. 20 individuals are assaulted every minute by their intimate partners. And then I start thinking about stats that we throw around at Fight the New Drug often, which, for example, one stat says research shows that women are almost always the target of violence and aggression in porn. And they estimate that it's about 97% of the time women are the target of violence and aggression. So in your career, Russ, during your time over those 30 years, how have you seen porn evolve? And how is it negatively impacting the consumer? And how does it correlate back to some of these stats, like that 20 people are assaulted every minute by their intimate partners in the US?
You just asked like three huge questions, right?
Yeah, I asked way too many questions. I acknowledge that for sure.
It's all good. So I think, I've done some work with a colleague, specifically looking at men who perpetrate intimate partner violence. What is their experience of looking at pornography? And what we find is probably no surprise. There is a strong and direct correlation. Men who perpetrate violence and this has also been found by other researchers in terms of sexual assault, men who perpetrate violence tend to have higher rates of pornography use than the general population of men. And I think to your point, there is a scripting that goes on in pornography that men don't pay attention to. So one of the things that I talk with men about is that we know from kind of basic media literacy that when I am consuming any media, I am consuming not only what is presenting, but I'm also consuming the values that underlie what is presenting, right? So if I watch Star Wars, I'm not only consuming the show, but there are some values that are underneath, often hidden in the Star Wars trilogies that I'm also consuming.
Right.
If I'm paying attention, then I can notice what the values are. And then I can, with my 12-year-old, have a conversation around how does that reflect our values or not? And let's just notice that those values are there and spit out the ones that we don't like.
Right.
That's happening in pornography too, right? So you're consuming this pornography. There is this level of violence that's in pornography, whether it's verbal violence or physical violence or choking or, whatever it is, that's normalized, that's accepted. So there's a value that I'm consuming with it. The challenge with pornography is that men aren't just viewing pornography, right? We're masturbating while we're doing it. And what masturbation does is it explodes the brain. It is more, your brain is more receptive. The learning or the values go deeper into our understanding, into our self, so in the way that we consume or experience the media.
There's a guy named Dr. Norman Deutsch, and I think that he stated the following. I might butcher the quote, but he said, pornography meets all the prerequisites for neuroplastic change.
Okay.
I think that's that sums up kind of like what you're talking about.
Yeah, much more succinctly than I just did.
No, you make a good point. And yeah, that's the point. Exactly.
And so what I think we're learning from looking at men who do use violence and their experience of viewing pornography is that there does seem to be this kind of neuroplasticity effect. They're reading this, they're looking at this, they're masturbating to it, and then they want to try it for real. And the pornography lie is that women like it, that it increases their pleasure.
Yep.
That her saying no or her crying or her turning away or her screaming is actually an expression of pleasure. And, how does that induce anybody to empathy or compassion?
Right.
And back to the lesson I learned from my parents, those empathy and compassion has to be a foundation for good sex. And if these guys are A, learning that from the pornography use, and B, not learning a counter story in any way, where do men get the counter story? Where do men learn that empathy and compassion is a foundation for good sex?
The Notebook. They're getting it from the Notebook.
Right.
Maybe, but not very many sources is what you're saying. And yeah, I think that's a factual statement that you are shining a light on, or a factual thing that's occurring in society right now is men oftentimes don't have a place to turn to learn about healthy sexuality.
Right.
Do you know of a person named Al Bandura? Does that name ring a bell for you?
Oh,
he's the social learning theory guy.
Yes, thank you.
The social learning theory guy. He states, he came up with this theory, the social learning theory, and it states that we as individuals, we as human beings don't actually have to experience something to learn. That we can learn through observation.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of sums up what we're talking about here is social learning and porn consumption. What is it teaching kids? What is it teaching men?
Yeah.
Looking for a way to spread awareness on the harms of porn? Why not rep the movement in one of our conversation-starting tees? With over 20 tees in various designs and phrases, you're bound to find something that speaks to you and will spark conversations with others. Plus, because we're a 501c3 nonprofit, there are no taxes on your purchase, and 100% of the proceeds from your purchase help to mobilize this movement. Get your gear today at ftnd.org/shop. That's ftnd.org/shop.
So over the course of your career, have you seen porn evolve at all? And can you talk to how porn has evolved?
I think the biggest way it's evolved is kind of what you described, is, going from, the magazine version to the film version, and now the accessibility version that it's everywhere. I think, when it was magazines that you had to have someplace, you had to buy someplace, and then so hold.
And you had to show your ID.
Yeah, you had to show your ID to get it. It was still pictures. It meant that. So one of the things that I think the end answer, I think, is one of the things that has evolved is this level of prevalence and anonymity that now happens in men's pornography use. And that combination really leads to a complete lack of accountability, right? Men no longer have to have any semblance, any pretense of being accountable for their pornography use, because it is on our devices. And I can hit the private button and look at whatever I want to look at, and then go home to my partner, and she would never know unless she has some kind of way, and I don't have to own it, right? And unless she has some kind of way to get through the firewalls that I know well enough to put up that she's not going to look.
Yeah. I did that for 6 years of marriage. So I know from personal experience that you can get away with porn consumption.
Absolutely. And, not that, that lack of accountability. Not only am I not being accountable for my behavior, I'm completely undermine my accountability around the harm that does. Even if my partner doesn't know it, if I'm sneaking around, I'm doing damage to her, I'm doing damage to our relationship.
Right. And I want to call myself out if I can, because I just said that I knew on a personal level that I could get away with porn consumption. And that's actually not true. I didn't get away with anything. Like my wife, she was not aware of my porn consumption, so I got away with it in that sense. But like you're talking to, it negatively impacted me. It negatively impacted my mind. It negatively impacted our relationship, even though she didn't know about the porn consumption. So I didn't get away with anything. Like there were negative consequences. Just want to state that for the record.
Thank you for clarifying. That's a good point. And again, I think, that level of honesty, that level of transparency, men don't very often have experiences of being able to have that with each other around this topic.
Yeah.
And, the work I do is very much around how do we create spaces where men can. Because one of the things that I found has happened is that because of the prevalence and the anonymity issue and the understanding, this acceptance that all men use pornography, we don't understand those nuance of differences between your experience and mine. And what I found when I've been in these rooms is that there is tremendous differences in men's experiences of using pornography. So one example is, we'll have men talk about their different experiences, and some men, they're in their 30s or 40s or 50s. And there are some men who are drawn to teen pornography. There are some men who are like, you know what, that's my daughter, that's my granddaughter. I see anything around teen pornography just like grosses me out. I can't watch that. Well, when are men able to talk about that kind of nuance of difference? What I think what happens with the social norming of men's pornography use is that most men, therefore, social norm that their pornography use is just like every other man's. So every man is, every man likes teens. And so for them to hear that, oh no, there are some men who don't. Yes, they view pornography, but they don't view that pornography. We've had some men say, you know what, the minute there's any slapping, I turn it off because that triggers something about my past when my dad beat up my mom or what, to hear that kind of to hear them share those stories and have to confront each other.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, have to confront their own experience by somebody else that they have developed some respect and care for. It makes them have to start rethinking, wow, really? So that's not the norm.
Mm-hmm.
That is a really powerful moment.
Yeah. There's some research that is relevant to this conversation. I think this moment of the conversation, it's a study from 2016 and it found that 47% of respondents reported that over time, they began watching pornography that had previously disinterested or even disgusted them. And so in this study alone, if 47% of the respondents did experience that, that means that 53% did not. So we're not saying that everyone who consumes pornography will go down this route, but some do. And I'm wondering if in your experience, while you sit in the rooms with these individuals, with these men talking about their porn consumption, do you ever hear people talk about that aspect of their porn consumption becoming escalating behavior, meaning they are searching out different types of porn that previously disinterested or even disgusted them?
Yes. And I heard from you kind of two parallel questions. One was, sliding down that slope to doing what previously disgusted me, and also sliding down or starting that. When does pornography consumption become an addictive behavior? Right? And addiction is a what's the word I'm looking for? Addiction is a progressive disease, whether it's with alcohol and drugs or whether it's pornography or whether it's with food. It starts as some kind of thing that may or may not be problematic, and then it starts to become problematic. But there's a difference between being problematic and being addictive. And so I've heard both of those conversations in the rooms where men are starting to question or have started to question whether or not they're addicted to this, but they've never been in a space where they can actually say that question out loud. And in this group, they feel like they get to a point, obviously not early on, but in the part of the conversation, in the context of the space that we create, they're able to say out loud, I wonder if I'm addicted to this. And I think you know as well as I do, when you ask that question, the answer is yes. When you're asking whatever the addiction is, if you're asking the question, I wonder if I'm addicted to alcohol, the answer is probably yes. If you're asking the question, I wonder if I'm addicted to pornography, the answer is probably yes. I don't do addiction work.
Maybe that also to challenge you a little bit on that. I want to step in for the audience, because maybe there's some people out there who ask themselves that question. Am I addicted? Mm-hmm. There's a misconception that if you consume porn, you are addicted. According to experts, most consumers of porn are not addicted.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
And I think that that's a misconception and I just wanted to clarify that, because in your statement, like if you are asking the question, am I addicted? Then it's probably likely that you are addicted. I think that definitely can be the case. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also possible to be curious about addiction, but you personally aren't experiencing an addiction. Like I personally got curious about my porn consumption. I never got diagnosed. I've only been to 2 therapy sessions in my life. And I've never been diagnosed for compulsive sexual behavior or any of that. I just self-diagnosed it. I just got curious about my own porn consumption. And I self-diagnosed that I probably had a compulsive behavior around it. Mm-hmm. But I just wanted to clarify that, because sometimes it can be harmful to label yourself addicted. Is that your understanding, or what's your understanding on that label?
And I appreciate your challenge that, I absolutely agree that, just watching pornography doesn't mean you're addicted. And I think the experience from other kinds of addictions pretty often dictates that most people do not ask the question about whether or not they are addicted unless they're starting to have a problem with it.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Most people who drink alcohol don't ask themselves, am I addicted? Unless
they're starting to see a trend.
Yeah, unless they're, it's starting to negatively affect their behavior, and they're not paying attention. Yeah. Unless they're starting to realize that I can't stop.
Yeah.
I keep saying I'm only going to have one beer tonight, and I never have one beer tonight. That's when they ask the question. I suspect that's true with pornography as well. That that at the moment when somebody starts asking the question, "Am I addicted?" It's not because, like you, they were just got curious. It's because this is starting to affect me negatively, harmfully, and I'm seeing these negative effects. So maybe there's something here. Well, if you're asking the question, maybe there's something here. There's probably something there,
right? Okay,
whether it's addiction or whatever, there's something there that's worth paying attention to.
Right.
Again, I just want to reinstate. Thank you for saying that, because that is a really important myth to explode that, men viewing pornography is not necessarily addiction.
Yeah. You talked to how porn has changed in the sense that it went from pictures to video to the internet to the smartphone. But can you also speak to how porn has changed in regards to the messaging within porn? Have you seen more sadomasochistic themes being put into porn? Have you noticed porn becoming more and more violent and aggressive over your time in this career?
That's a really good question. I remember, back in the 80s and 90s, there being some research on pornography and acknowledging that there was a lot of violence in pornography. The stat that you shared earlier, that 90-something% of pornography includes some version of slapping or hitting or.
I think the stat that I mentioned was that 97% of the time that there is violence, and 97% of the time it's toward women. Like they are the target of the violence 97% of the time.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, because thinking about my own experience, Russ, I told you that I grew up watching porn, and back in the day, the way that I would have explained hardcore porn to someone, I would have said that it was like the explicit depiction of intercourse. That's how I labeled hardcore porn when I was in high school, compared to an image of a topless girl in a cornfield in a Playboy magazine. That's how I would differentiate between softcore porn and hardcore porn when I was in high school. Today, I label hardcore porn as what is popping up on the free tube sites. A lot more violence, a lot more aggression, a lot more degrading behaviors. What is your opinion? Do you agree with that? Has it evolved?
I have to say I'm a step further away, because I don't look at pornography in any way anymore. So I don't know what. Yeah, I don't know what it looks like.
Okay. But you sit in the groups with the men,
right?
Do they talk about the violence and aggression that they see, or no?
We are more focused on their experience to it than what they see.
Yeah.
The one time that kind of comes up is there's an activity that we do that's it's called the harm continuum, and we have on one end of the room is least harmful, on one end of the room is most harmful, and we have some, both how we look at pornography and what we see. So those kinds of that in that activity, sometimes they bring up their own, and then I ask them to bring their own experiences to the table, and then we put that on the continuum too. So there's these pre-established ones, and then these emergent examples that they bring. And so those experiences or those examples come up in that activity, but beyond that, there's not a lot. I mean, it's only 6 sessions, so there's not a lot of room for those kinds of details to come up.
Right. Do you see men transition into a better version of themselves during these 6 sessions?
Very much so. I think, the easiest example is how we developed the program in and of itself. So again, the program is What's Wrong with This Picture. It started out as a 2-session, I don't want to call it a curriculum because that sounds too grandiose. 2 sessions chit chat. And we used the design is called Emergent curriculum design, which means you kind of outline what it is that you want to do with a group of men or a group. And then you let them know that we want you to critically engage in this and help us flush out the curriculum. So our intention is to build out a curriculum. I don't want to write this as, a 40-something-year-old looking out my window. I want to write this so it has some real meaning, which means you are co-authors of this curriculum.
Yeah.
So the success is even in the product itself. These men came into the room not knowing what the hell they were going into. They brought them their best part of themselves, and they helped us flesh out and develop over 2 years what became the end product. They brought really good thinking. They brought examples of activities. They a lot of the exercises and activities they came up with in real time around how do we get men to understand this. One of the things, kind of as an example of that, one of the things that that they became insistent on was we kind of had flushed it out as this program that left them with the knowledge. And they came back and said, you know what, that ain't good enough, because you're talking about all the problems that come from viewing pornography that result in pornography. You talk about these other dynamics of gender inequality, and you're not giving us any skills to actually take action. And so from their insistence, the last two sessions are all around being change agents. The seventh session is, how you as individually can be a change agent. And then the last session, along with the kind of graduation, is how do you as a collective become change agents? And there are groups that I did this program with 2 years ago that it was supposed to be time limited, right? This 8 weeks, they're still meeting and they're still, organizing in their communities around what they can do.
That's cool.
Whether it's around fighting pornography, maybe it's around promoting gender equality, maybe it's ending domestic violence. They may have pivoted the focus, but the fact is they're still meeting as a group, working to make their community a better place.
It's one of the ripple effects.
Yes, there's lots and lots of positive examples.
That's great. I think that it's important to acknowledge that we are a product of our environment, right? That's one of the factors, one of the variables that comes into play when we're talking about how does someone become and who they are today. Because we're unique individuals with unique biology and unique experiences, those are basically the variables. If I had to sum it up, I'd say those are the variables that make us unique. So we have to acknowledge that we are a product of our environment. And so I think that before we condemn men, we have to acknowledge the role, like what role men have been asked to play in society. And in my experience, when I was growing up, violence was encouraged. I grew up playing football where violence was encouraged. Mm-hmm. The goal was to hit someone as hard as you can to help your team win the game. Yeah. If I think about my grandpa's experience, my grandpa had to go to war. He was asked to go to war. He was asked to fight. He was celebrated because of that. Mm-hmm. But he had negative experiences during his time in war. And he came home, and in this era, there was no diagnosis for PTSD.
Right.
It didn't exist in the DSM. And so my grandpa had to take that on alone. He was asked to not only fight for his country, but he was also asked to provide for a family. And my dad experienced some childhood abuse at the hands of his dad. Mm-hmm. But my grandpa, to his defense, he didn't have the tools or the resources to address the trauma that was there. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know where I'm going with this question, Russ. I kind of got off on a side tangent because it's something that's really important to me. I mentioned that I try to embrace my masculinity. I want to become the best version of myself. I think that each of us as individuals want to become the best version of ourselves. I know my grandpa, he wanted to become the best version of himself, but he was asked to do some things that negatively impacted him. And I'm just wondering I guess the question is like, how do we as a society, how do we acknowledge the role that men have been asked to play, and yet at the same time empower men to become the best version of themselves? Yeah. That's, and I know I ended that sentence as if it was going to continue, but yeah, that's the question, I guess. I don't know, Russ.
That's a great lead in. That's a great question. I think you're right. We are the products of our environment. I'm going to come back to this. I think we are both products and producers of our environment.
Yeah.
Which I think gets back to the second question. And I think acknowledging the really impossible position that our environment puts male type people in, right? We're supposed to be, I have a 12-year-old, but he's already learned the messages around you don't show emotion, you don't express feeling. And he's got me as a father. I cry at a good Hallmark commercial. So I think our environment does a lot to strip men away from having real connection with each other, from feeling their emotions, God forbid, expressing their emotions, from engaging in caring work. We aren't, look at our policies. What community has a policy that actually encourages fathers to take time off with your baby, actually take paternity leave?
Mm.
We barely have parental leave, but the parental leave that we have is kind of, so it's socialized to all be diverted to the mom, and dads don't get any. Or if they do, it's because they earn their vacation time and, just demand it. I'm going to take time with my baby. Daggone it.
Right.
And I think, the last answer that I have to your question is that, reminding men that we are also producers of our environment, and taking some of that power back, that the social environment around me, yes, it is created, but the way that I interact with it or push back with it or challenge it allows me to make some changes. I can, again, I talk with my 12-year-old son all the time, is that you help create the social environment at your school.
Yeah.
And when you do things like wear your Be Kind shirt, that is part of creating a social environment in your school. And so get intentional, man. Get intentional around what is the kind of environment that you want your school to be. And no, you don't have the whole answer, because you're one of 1,000, but you're one of 1,000.
Mm.
And when you show up in your best self and show up like that, my own experience is that tends to attract people to you. And so you show up in your Be Kind shirt, and there's a whole lot of other people who maybe don't have a Be Kind shirt or don't know there's a shirt that has that message on it, but all of a sudden they see you wearing that and they're like, ooh, I want to be like him. And all of a sudden there's not just one of you, maybe there's 10, or maybe there's 15, or maybe there's 100. And that, now you're starting to change the environment.
Yeah. You said that people would be attracted to that kindness. I also think sometimes people are not attracted to that kindness, and that's more telling on them as an individual.
Yeah, absolutely.
They have some more work to do. Well, we are deep into the conversation, and I don't know if I understand how you got interested in porn, talking about porn. Have you always focused on porn consumption, or at what point did that become one of your focuses?
It was one of my focuses from early on. So my entree into this work was, so first of all, my household was a little bit like a lot of households. There was paradoxes in the household. So yes, my parents talked about human sexuality, and right next to Our Bodies, Ourselves and their other human sexuality textbooks on our dining room bookshelf was my dad's Penthouse subscription. So I grew up like you. Pornography was absolutely accepted and normalized and okie dokie. When I went to undergraduate school as a social work major, and my intro to social work class as a sophomore, was the teacher was really clear. Social work is not sociology. Sociology is a theoretical degree. Social work is a practical degree. We go and practice. So y'all go find some place to practice. And I searched and I struggled and I tried to find a placement, and I ended up working at the local rape crisis center, which was a dual rape crisis center domestic violence agency. And so my entree into, I'll hook in pornography in a minute, but my entree into this was going to this rape crisis center, learning how to be a rape crisis advocate at the same time that I was 18 years old, living in an all men's dorm in South Texas. And that sea change around what was mostly women's experience like after being assaulted, and then coming back and starting to critically listen to how we as men talked about the women that we dated or wanted to date or who refused our dating. I started to put one and one together and get an answer that I didn't want. Yeah. Right. I started to realize that, rather than pointing my finger at those men who rape, you point a finger at somebody else, you got three fingers pointing back at yourself.
Right.
Right. Somewhere in that experience, and I was still looking at pornography at this time. Somewhere in that experience, I had my first experience of going to a presentation on the harms of pornography. And it blew my mind because it was about me. It was around, she asked some of the questions like, we know X percentage of women who are depicted in pornography, and this was still the Playboy Penthouse magazine version. This was still in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So, some of the data that they knew then that, X percent of the women who are being depicted in these pornography are not actually enjoying it. They're actually being forced.
Mm.
So as you're masturbating to this, how do you know the difference between a woman whose rape was just depicted and your masturbation fantasy? And the fact that I couldn't answer that question, or, the answer was, I don't know.
Yeah.
Really, like your experience, that rocked my world.
Yeah.
And so that's where I
destroyed the fantasy.
It destroyed the fantasy. And I'm going back into a dorm where it is blatant that it was not a hidden secret. It was very, very open that all of us had our pornography library and, all this stuff. And I'm like, it was 2 years of just brutal kind of eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of where I kind of pivoted and really dove into this around how do we, again, because I was living in an all-men's dorm most of this time, it created an opportunity. I became very aware of the lack of conversation that men had with each other, and how whatever conversation men did have with each other was undermining the conversation that women wanted us to have, or that the women were trying to have with us around being respectful, being equal, about respect, equality, and justice.
Yeah. Around true intimacy.
And we can't, it's unfair and it's unsafe, I think, to invite women into those spaces to try and open things up. Completely unfair. Women got their own work to do with their own selves. So I'm here, I'm with the men, I'm in the dorm.
Yeah.
So who better than me to try and, dive into the space.
Yeah. I can agree with you on that. As I was in the locker room growing up, that's one aspect of the locker room it never resonated with me. It never sat well with me. I did not like that type of discussion. And I think that it is important as men, when we see those behaviors, when we experience those misogynistic behaviors, we need to call them out for what they are, and be part of the solution, right?
Right. And be back to your point earlier around how we are products of our environment. One of the things that I think makes it challenging for us as men to be these kinds of change agents is that our voice shakes, right? The mythology is that I'm always supposed to be authoritative and confident and know what I'm doing. Well, shit. Half the time I was challenging other men or asking questions, I was so scared my voice was shaking. That's being human.
Yeah.
And so let's give space for the fact that our voice shakes sometimes.
Yeah. When society says that men aren't emotional, I call bullshit on that. We are definitely emotional beings. And I think that we just have a tough time, and this is for all individuals, not just men. We have a tough time identifying and articulating our emotions. To be emotionally intelligent takes a lot of effort.
Yes.
It doesn't happen by accident. And so I love that you are calling men to become the best version of themselves, which includes being more emotionally intelligent. Well, before we end, I just want to leave you with the opportunity to have the last word during this conversation. If there's anything on your heart or mind, or something you haven't stated that you want to state, or that you want to reemphasize, now's that time. I just, for the listeners, for the audience, I just want to kind of bounce back to the idea and the experience that you all have had here
by listening to this, by listening to us engage in this dialogue as two men. I hope you've learned something around what even two men who don't know each other across the country through this two-dimensional dynamic we call Zoom, we're still able to get to some level of authenticity and intimacy with each other, and feel in your bodies what that was like to experience on your end. And imagine what that might be like to actually be in a room with men who can go where we just went, and the kind of change that suggests. We can do what we need to do in your community, wherever that is, in our community, in this country. We can make the change that we need to make.
Thanks, Russ. We appreciate you. We appreciate the time you spent with us today.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Research has demonstrated that overcoming a pornography habit is absolutely possible, and that over time, pornography's negative effects can be managed and largely reversed. So, are you ready to quit porn for good? Meet Fortify, an online recovery program that has helped tens of thousands of individuals around the world stop their porn habit in its tracks. Fortify's free, science-based recovery platform is dedicated to helping you find lasting freedom from pornography. You can connect with others, learn how to better understand your compulsive behavior, and track your recovery journey. Join Fortify for free today at ftnd.org/Fortify. That's ftnd.org/Fortify. You're not alone. Recovery is possible. Quit porn for good with Fortify. Fight the New Drug is an affiliate of Fortify and may receive financial support from purchases made using affiliate links.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Consider Before Consuming. Consider Before Consuming is brought to you by Fight the New Drug. Fight the New Drug is a non-religious and non-legislative organization that exists to provide individuals the opportunity to make an informed decision regarding pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects using only science, facts, and personal accounts. If you'd like to learn more about today's guest and the conversation we had, you can check out the links included with this episode. If you've enjoyed listening to Consider Before Consuming, consider subscribing and leaving a review. Again, big thanks to you for listening to this conversation. As you go about your day, we invite you to increase your self-awareness, look both ways, check your blind spots, and consider before consuming.